Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this press briefing for the Europe region. I hope you can hear me, and please, hopefully you're all muted for now, and I'd appreciate if you could stay muted for now, and please do send your questions via the chat function, and we will get to those in a moment. My name is Chris Gota. I'm part of the corporate communications team at IATA, and it's my pleasure to introduce Rafael Schvartzman, who is IATA's Regional Vice President for Europe. Rafael's going to speak to you for a few minutes, and then we'll take your questions. And at the conclusion of this press briefing, we will be issuing a press release that will sum up the key points Rafael's going to make and have some further information in that. Rafael, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone, and for your time. Today, I'd like to update you on the situation regarding the impact of this COVID-19 shutdown of air traffic on both the airline industry and the economies of Europe. Excuse me. Although there has been a slight pickup in traffic since the low point of April, I think it is important to keep this in context. Air traffic is still way down on last year levels, and even with last week's relaxation of the restrictions across the Schengen borders, recovery is still going to be very slow. Passenger numbers are going to be down by around half compared to last year. Increased costs, government regulations, economic uncertainty, passenger health concerns, and above all, the continuing existence of quarantine measures are going to weigh heavily on the prospects of recovery. It is not far-fetched to say that the worst might yet to come. Let's start by looking at the current impact. Latest research from IATA Economics shows us that the economic devastation on air transport and consequently European economies is getting worse. For example, an analysis of the top 5 markets in Europe shows that the decline in passengers, the impact on airline revenues, the risk of job losses, and the fall on GDP for 2020 are all worse than our previous estimates that we made in April. To give you some examples, in the UK, more than 730,000 jobs are at risk, an increase of 70,000 compared to our April estimate. In Spain, compared to April, the numbers of passengers are down 124.5 million. That is 10 million worse, actually, of the previous estimate. Excuse me. In Germany, the impact on airline revenues will be $19.5 billion, down by an extra 1.6 billion from our April estimates. And in France, the GDP impact of the collapse in air travel will now be $38.9 billion, up from $35.2 billion estimated in April. The press release we will be issuing shortly will contain a table which will give you the updated figures for more than 20 countries in Europe, and I invite you to draw a comparison with figures, the ones that we published in April. So it is clear that the economic damage is considerable for both the aviation industry and the many businesses that rely on our connectivity. So what is it to be done? There are 2 things that government must prioritize. First, a coordinated restart of air travel, and second, a continued financial and regulatory support. Let's take this in turns. It is essential that governments coordinate the restart of air connectivity consistently and in line with international best practice. The guidance set out by the International Civil Aviation Organization is broadly consistent with measures recommended by EASA, ECDC, and strikes the right balance between safeguarding public health while permitting viable air services. The measures, including more thorough and frequent cleaning and the wearing of face masks, further reduce the already low risk of transmission on board. Other measures, such as airport screening, where appropriate, discouraging symptomatic passengers from traveling, and safe destination protocols can also reduce the role of aviation as a potential source of international reinfection and render quarantine unnecessary. And let's be clear, quarantine measures are a huge impediment to a recovery in air traffic. Our latest passenger survey shows that 78% of people in France, 76% in Germany, and 83% in the UK will not travel if a quarantine is in place. Therefore, governments looking to reopen their economies need an alternative risk-based solution. The answer is a strategy that combines coordinated, internationally consistent health measures for air travel with effective national plans for managing the COVID-19. Secondly, the issue of support for aviation. Many European governments have recognized the strategic importance of their aviation industries and provided support, and we're grateful for all of that. Those actions have saved thousands of jobs and are enabling airlines to keep connectivity going. It is important to note, however, that much of the financial aid that has been in the forms of loans, which are adding to the debt burden for airlines and which will hinder their ability to invest in new services, greener aircraft, and expanded employment going forward. I am fearful that the worst might yet to come. Airlines rely on summer season to provide a financial cushion for the more challenging winter month. But we know that European airlines are set to lose $23 billion this year. There will be no summer cushion. At the same time, governments are looking to unwind the support they have been given for wages and job retention. Air traffic control charges to be in the tune of 2 billion euros will be due. As things stand, airlines will not have the flexibility to manage their slot portfolio in a way which maximizes efficiency and preserves the most essential routes. All this means that continued relief measures will be essential to minimize job losses and keep connectivity going. We would urge European regulators to prioritize an extension to the waiver granted for the slots use rule and to consider other forms of financial aid that will not add to the growing debt burden weighing airlines down. A solution to the air traffic control charges issue must also be found. Europe's economies have been brought to their knees by COVID-19, and the aviation industry has been especially hard hit. Recent optimism over the opening of the Schengen borders should not obscure the critical seriousness of the situation. Across Europe, the continued shutdown and the potential unwinding of wages and job support could result in more than 6 million jobs in the airline industry and those businesses supported by aviation being lost. For our future prosperity, it is imperative that the industry recovers as soon as possible. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Rafael. That's great. Thank you. So yes, we do have some questions, and I'm just going to take those now. So the first question is, do we expect the pardon me here. Do you expect the EU to lift its travel restrictions on non-essential travel into the EU from the rest of the world, and if so, when?
Well, I mean, the EU has already, stated the recommendation to open, and obviously the intra Schengen, well, the Schengen area. We also know for multiple discussions with IATA in a global level that there are discussions with multiple international, out of the European context destination. So everybody is working very hard to try to make this happen. I believe it will, and there has been obviously some announcements that as of July we will see some of those destinations, and we believe also that the set of measures that have been put in place, and as long as it is coordinated and consistently applied across the globe, that will actually give us certainty of the possibility to open those destinations as well. So yeah, I'm confident that will happen. But as we said, it will be gradual, and that's why we are foreseeing the level of losses that we have already estimated.
Yes, thank you, Rafael. And just in addition to that, as Rafael just mentioned, the calculations we've made for the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on the industry are based on a gradual lifting of restrictions, which start at national and regional level, and then in sort of Q3, Q4 of this year, we would expect to see a gradual relaxation of international restrictions. So the assumption is that this is going to be a phased process. Thank you. So we have a question from Tivadar. IATA requested a controlled and coordinated restart in the EU, but governments still don't seem to be cooperating on this level. Are we still urging cooperation? And do you have any estimates on the impact financially? So, Rafael, if you want to just be answering that point, I'll just dig out that final number. Thanks.
You're cutting off, so I couldn't hear your comments.
Oh, apologies. Let me repeat the question. So IATA have requested a controlled and coordinated restart in the EU, but governments still don't seem to be cooperating. Are we urging them to cooperate? And what would we be calling for there?
Okay, thanks. Thank you for the question. Actually, in the case of in the context of Europe, I do believe that the countries with the guidance issued by ICAO and the very obviously similar and very much aligned guidance issued by EASA and the ECDC, governments are applying those guidelines so far across Europe quite well. I would say, and this is in discussions with the different stakeholders around Europe, that the challenge is that many states are still under very exceptional conditions or state of alarm in some cases, or exceptional situations where even though the measures are in place, much of the decision is dependent on health authorities and assessment of the epidemiology situation per country. But obviously we see that is still an issue that is gradually being reduced by the application and obviously the trust that these recommendations, once in place, bring to different authorities. So it is on the Transport Authority, I would say we see a very good coordination and cooperation. I'm talking about the European level, but as Chris said, national and regional are the areas where we'll first start, and we obviously support that because we believe that will help the recovery process. I think it is important to note once health authorities as well feel that the system that we have put in place, the layered approach to bring security to the processes, and the low risk actually that aviation has in terms of being a factor to spread the virus, I think this will be very quickly solved. But obviously we are still hoping that this will happen sooner than later.
Thank you, Rafael. And Tivadar had a second part of his question, which I'll answer if I may, which is about the financial impact on the sector. So last week we talked about the financial forecast for the industry. Let me just give you some of the numbers for Europe, and it's very sobering news. So the projected loss for 2020 in Europe is $21.5 billion. $21.5 billion. That's just in Europe. That means that per passenger, European airlines will be losing more than $34 per passenger. More than $34 per passenger. So this is a very, very, very significant financial impact on the industry, and is really at the root note of our call for more assistance, more aid that is going to be needed right through the autumn winter season and beyond. Okay, back to our questions, and we have a couple more. So let's take Chris Jasper's question, where he is asking, how do you see prices evolving in Europe? Some analysts predict a price war, others sky-high prices given the slow return of capacity. And there's been conflicting scenarios from CEOs. What's the IATA view? I should just say before I invite Rafael to answer that obviously IATA has to be very cautious about what it can say on prices. We obviously can't speculate too much on that, but there are some historical trends which we can eliminate. Thanks.
Yeah, that is correct, Chris. Obviously, we do with the low demand that we see today, we obviously foresee steel prices to be, let's say, down. I mean, we don't foresee an increase in prices at this stage, and we're seeing that in general. It will, in the future, it will all depend, obviously, again, on if we are able to bring the right capacity at the right time. So it will all depend on how are we able to develop, right, the connectivity to maintain the level of competitiveness that maintains a very healthy competitive industry and to keep prices or fares at the very competitive rates. If that's not the case, obviously a restriction in the capacity could also have an impact on the future cost of travel, and we are very conscious about it. And obviously, we do believe that we need to restore aviation to its and the connectivity to maintain competitiveness as well.
Thank you, Rafael. We have a question around the slot rule situation. ACI Europe has rejected IATA's call to further extend the 80/20 slot rule relaxation. What do you think about that? How critical is that for Europe's airlines?
Well, it's the industry is, as I said just before. I mean, we are facing a very unprecedented crisis still today, and we are facing a very grim winter. If we already estimate that that's going to be the case. Obviously, it is very important probably to have seen already that the flexibility on the use of the slots, has been a key tool, actually, a tool that was deployed to support the industry, and we are testimony to that in the first wave. If you remember, we got a slot rule waiver that did not include the whole summer. Then later, obviously, proved to be needed, and we thank the support that came as well. And we are now seeing that the slow recovery, which was as well not necessarily predicted a few months ago, it does require that we need to do another extension or waiver of the slot regime for the winter season, to be able also to have to bring confidence and consistency in the restart of the industry. We see obviously also the importance of not having flights to be made with very low demand, meaning being also conscious of the environmental impact. And it is very important for planning purposes, obviously, to make sure that we have certainty, and airlines and airports are able to actually do planning according to how the industry is able to restart. And today, that certainty is not there. So we do believe and we urge, as in the past, and the waiver of the 80/20 slot rule for the winter period as well.
Thanks, Rafael. Just a couple of additional points there. I think there's precedent for this, not just with the current crisis, but in previous crises affecting big demand impact on air travel. And the other point being that we really need need to have it granted by the end of July at the latest. So one of ACI's points was that they didn't seem to be necessarily against a waiver, but they were saying that our call was premature. But the reality of the situation is that the industry needs to plan its schedule in August. So to give that stability and certainty, we need the waiver granted by end of July, and that's actually not very far away. So we would not say that our call was premature at all. In fact, it's very timely, especially when you consider that some branches of European governments start going on leave in mid-July. So that's why our timing was now. And I think the evidence is clear. And for those of you who saw the press briefing we gave on Tuesday earlier this week, that has a very detailed presentation from Brian Pierce, which goes into showing why we're going to face this grim winter with the bookings down. It's clear that the capacity is the demand is not returning in the winter period, and therefore this precedent that's been granted in the past for a slot waiver would certainly seem to be applicable this time. Thank you very much for those questions. I don't believe we have any more in the queue at this moment. If anyone wants to ask one, please go ahead. I will repeat that we will be issuing a press release shortly. In that, we will give updated numbers for the passenger impacts, the financial impact on airlines, and jobs and GDP issues that are at risk for more than 20 countries in Europe. I forget the precise number, but it's 20 plus. So hopefully you will find your country there, and if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and we will try and get you any further information you need. But that release will be coming out in approximately half an hour's time.
Thank you. Thank you very much as well.
Yes, well, thank you, Rafael. We have another question come in from Chris. Let's take this question. So, will the release have your last forecast numbers? If not, when was the previous statement out? So, the forecast that we put out on the profitability numbers that I was quoting a few minutes ago, that we released last week, Chris. So I will contact you separately after this call and send you the links to those to the data tables that were published. And we have another question from Sally. So, Rafael, do you think Europe will see air bridges or travel corridors coming in to alleviate quarantine?
Well, this is definitely a consideration by the governments. I mean, I would say outside of the Schengen area, right? Because obviously, as I said, the assessment on the the epidemiological situation per country. So we do believe that will be the case. It's still not very clear how will that take form. And we, for example, obviously we do know that the UK, as an example, is obviously working specifically on some framework for that. So it will be possible, definitely, that it will happen. We have seen some initiatives, obviously, in certain areas to open up borders within certain regions, like some of the Nordic and Baltic countries doing, or the case of Australia and New Zealand. So we will probably see some of those cases happening, definitely. Now, what the framework will be is not necessarily clear, as this is being evaluated by states and not necessarily within the framework of either ICAO or the ASA and ECDC guidelines, which is what we need to obviously make sure that we apply those guidelines worldwide, and that we do believe if by doing that we're actually putting in place a very strong biosecurity system, which with a layer approach, which can prevent actually the spreading of the virus through air transport. So we do believe if we apply that consistently across the world, then we will have a much higher certainty that obviously traveling is safe in that regard. But obviously we do also believe that governments are evaluating travel corridors and probably will be part of the slow restart, let's say.
Yes, thank you, Rafael. We have another question, a little similar to the prices question we had earlier, but this time about capacity. Airlines are keen to add more capacity to stimulate the market, so fares could go down. What is IATA's view on this? Is this a good mindset and behaviour, or would it just cause overcapacity? And again, I have to obviously say that we're not in the business of predicting what airlines are going to do on capacity, but I'm sure there are some general rules that Rafael can refer to.
Yeah. Well, I think exactly. I mean, at this stage, it will be interesting to know when will be the time we will have overcapacity again, because at this stage, obviously, what we are trying is to restart the economies, right? I mean, and a strategic element to restarting the economies of Europe is air transport, and I already highlighted in my message the impact to the economies around Europe, and obviously, as Chris mentioned in our release, there are some numbers in terms of the impacts to different countries. So we see a very important element in restarting the economies, and obviously the demand will start coming back. As long as we keep building the system in a way that is, consistent, and it brings security to the passengers. I mean, they are willing to travel. Obviously, we said, I mean, if you obviously put a quarantine in place, that discourages individuals in willingness to travel, right? So these are the things that obviously we are concerned about. So the measures that we are encouraging for governments to take are the recommended by ICAO, EASA, and the ECDC. And we obviously believe that once those measures are in place, then obviously the quarantine, we believe that quarantine is counterproductive to actually stimulating demand. So, and that will, again, as I said, I will, I'm not too sure that will be a case of overcapacity necessarily. And that's also linked to, again, saying, making sure that we do get the slot waiver, not to have the need to fly, obviously, empty flights to maintain those slots.
Thank you, Rafael. Just as a coda to that, the forecast we put out last week had a prediction for RPK growth and then ASK growth, or in other words, capacity for Europe. And so we can see that capacity is, ASK growth will be minus 42.9%. So effectively, the number of available seats will fall nearly 43%. And that's marginally lagging the collapse in passenger demand, as we mentioned, which is running at over 50%. In fact, will be 56.4%. So we do see that the load factor will be falling. But this is a reflection of the fact that airlines were unable to cut capacity as fast as demand was falling in this unprecedented situation. So obviously they'll be looking to rebalance that when they can. Right, let's just go back and see if we have any more questions. We do not. So I think in that case, thank you for your time today. Thank you, Rafael, for coming on the line and answering the questions. As I said, keep an eye out for the press release, and if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact me or anyone in Colcom. Thanks very much again for your time.
Thank you.